Hey guys, this is Dave with Gazaudio. Today I'm going to be reviewing Fio's latest TWS earphone, the FW3. And to be honest, I've never really been a huge fan of TWS earphones because I just prefer wired over wireless, although I do like to have a pair on hand just as a backup for mowing a lawn or going on a run. But again, most of my listening is done with wired IEMs. That being said, I know things are improving on the wireless front all the time, and I've actually been kind of curious about some of the newer TWS releases. So today we're going to take a pretty close look at the FW3 and maybe try to determine whether or not I should be taking the TWS market a little more seriously. But before we jump in, let's take a look at what's included in the box with the FW3. Of course, we have the IEMs themselves. They also include a handy charging case, 6 pairs of ear tips, and a short USB Type A to Type C cable. Now, before we jump into the specifications, I quickly want to give a little bit of a backstory behind the development of the FW3. So recently, Fiio released the FW5, which is also a TWS, but it has a hybrid driver configuration, and it uses 2 balanced armature drivers and a dynamic driver, and subsequently that's reflected in its pricing, coming in at $149. But from what I understand, Fiio felt like that price point was a little too high for their consumer target, so they set out to develop a more affordable TWS, but with a goal of retaining as much of the FW5's sound quality as possible. So from what I understand, in order to achieve that, they eliminated the 2 BA drivers and replaced them with an upgraded single 10mm carbon-based dynamic driver. They also used the same earpiece housing moldings that were used for the FW5 to save money on the production side, which is why the shell looks basically identical with the exception of the coating process. The FW3 shell uses metallic paint instead of a vacuum-applied coating. But more importantly, they stuck with the same QCC 5141 Bluetooth chip and the AKM Velvet Sound AK4332 DAC chip used in the FW5, which they felt was very important because those are the 2 primary components that allow for high-resolution Bluetooth decoding. So those are just a few of the ways they were able to bring down the cost of the FW3, which is fairly substantial because now instead of paying $149, you can pick a pair of the FW3s up for $100. But in regards to the rest of the specifications, the built-in QCC 5141 Bluetooth chip can decode all of your basic Bluetooth codecs, including SBC, AAC, aptX, aptX Adaptive, LHDC, and LDAC. Unfortunately, the higher resolution codecs are not compatible with iOS devices, and they can only be decoded with Android devices. As far as battery life, if you have a full charge on the case, it should give you about 3 full charges on your IEMs, totaling about 21 hours of playback time, so about 7 hours of playback per charge. It also gives you 4 physical volume control and playback buttons on the top of the left and right housings. And then one last thing I want to quickly touch on is the Fiio Control app, because it does give you access to some pretty cool features. Now, if you open the app, the first page it will take you to is My Devices. You can then add the FW3 by simply clicking on the plus icon in the upper right-hand corner. And then once you're connected, you just tap on the FW3 icon. Then it will take you to the status page, which then gives you a few more options. It gives you the option to turn the indicator light on or off, turn battery protection on or off, enable game mode, choose idle power off time, and finally select your Bluetooth codec. Then the second tab gives you access to a basic EQ. The third tab allows you to adjust your channel balance, select some filters, headphone volume, tone volume, and call volume, and then you can choose the language of the tones. And then finally, the last tab is the user guide for the FW3. Okay, let's talk about the sound of the FW3. So I should tell you, while I did test these with both movies and games, most of my testing was done listening to music, because I just don't typically use IEMs for movies and gaming that often. That being said, the FW3 seemed to work fine for both of those applications. I didn't have any problems feeling immersed in the movies or games, and when I switched to gaming mode, I had no issues with latency, and my general experience was simply very good for both uses. As for the sound of the FW3, the overall sound signature is basically neutral, but with some added bass and treble emphasis. But the emphasis is relatively mild, so it doesn't quite push it into the V-shape category. But if we break it down a little further, starting with the bass, of course, as I had mentioned before, they got away from the hybrid configuration with the two balanced armature drivers and single dynamic driver in the FW5 and opted for a single upgraded 10mm dynamic driver instead. That being said, I think they made a smart choice by doing that, because it's my preferred type of driver when it comes to bass reproduction and maintaining natural instrument timbre. And while we do know the limitations of a dynamic driver, and while it may not give you lots of bass speed like a balanced armature driver, it's still going to give you adequate bass speed. But what it will give you that most BA drivers can't is excellent dynamics and punch, and then also that impact and that visceral sensation that, again, you can only get from a dynamic driver. And that's exactly what the FW3 delivers, along with pretty decent control and really good extension. So you get plenty of sub-bass rumble, but also really good amounts of mid-bass punch and thump. And then as you move into the mid-bass and lower mids, you do have a little bit of trade-off in terms of mid-bass texture and low-mid clarity. However, it's fairly clean and it doesn't seem to bleed too much into the mid-range. And then as you move into the mids, again, there is some lower mid-range presence, which adds some warmth, and it's going to give some instruments that land there and also some male vocals a nice amount of added richness and note weight. Again, this is a dynamic driver, which means you don't have to worry about any timbre issues. So instruments and vocals have a very natural presentation and just generally sound correct. As for mid-range detail, while the added warmth does seem to affect lower mid-range clarity a little bit, as you move into the rest of the mids and upper mids, much of that clarity is restored, and I would say it's very good, even better than what I would have expected from a $100 TWS earphone. And that clarity carries through into the treble as well, and while the treble does have a little more energy than I typically like, the level of treble detail is very good, and again, better than what I would have expected for a TWS in this price range. Treble extension is also very good, so it gave me lots of air and sparkle, and while cymbals and hi-hats sound detailed and crispy and have good energy, again, sometimes they can come across as a little overly splashy. That being said, they still sounded relatively natural, and that extra treble energy never got to the point of sounding harsh or becoming fatiguing, at least not for me. In regards to the FW3's technical performance, the only area I felt the FW3 lacked slightly was in detail retrieval, and that was mainly in the lower mid-range. But as I had mentioned before, as you move into the upper mids and treble, much of that detail is restored. And I feel the overall detail retrieval of the FW3 is actually very good, again, for TWS. And I will clarify what I mean by that in my conclusion in a minute. Soundstage is what I would consider to be on the wider side for an IM, probably due to the way they tuned the mids and treble. And again, combined with the good treble extension, it really does make for a very immersive and open presentation. However, I would say that instrument and vocal imaging is not as focused, and instruments can sound more like they're floating as opposed to having more density and sounding anchored within their space. But overall, I would say the FW3's technical performance is very good. So that brings me to my conclusion, and I feel I should clarify something, because I said several times throughout this review, I felt that certain attributes of the FW3 were very good for it being a $100 TWS. And here's why I use that qualifying statement. Based on my experience with the FW3 compared with most of the other TWS style earphones that I've owned, I think because of the advancements in Bluetooth technology in general, but also because I know that Fiio really spent a great deal of time and money in product research and development for the FW3, but I think they do that with most of their stuff. In terms of tuning, I truly feel like this is probably one of the best TWS earphones I've heard at this price, and even competes with many wired IEMs in the $100 price range, and I've got a few. That being said, I still think you can achieve better overall performance with wired IEMs. Take the Galileo or the Keymed Classic, for example. So what it really boils down to as it always has for me, and I'm sure it does for most consumers, is convenience. And I have to ask myself, when I'm out and about mowing the lawn or just going on a run or a walk, is it more important for me to have excellent sound? Or is it okay to have good sound, but not have to worry about fussing with wires and cables? And for those tasks, I'll always choose convenience over sound. However, if I'm just listening at home or even traveling, whether in a plane or a car, I don't mind dealing with cables and wires, especially if it's a longer trip. But the bottom line is, I think it's good to have the option, and the FW3 is an excellent option in my opinion, especially for $100. And while I may be able to get better sound for the same price with a Galileo, I don't always have time to grab everything I need. And sometimes for me, and I'm sure again, for most consumers, convenience takes priority over excellent sound. But now, Fiio has minimized that compromise because the Fiio FW3 still offers very good sound and convenience, and it's priced at a very affordable $100. That being said, if you are in the market for a TWS and you have a budget of around $100, I highly recommend the FW3. So that concludes my review of the Fiio FW3. If you're new to the channel and you like our videos, please take a minute and hit that subscribe button. And if you want to go a step further, you can also support us through our Patreon. I'll be sure and leave a link in the description. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to watch this review. Please like this video, please share this video. I hope you have an awesome day.